has to do with the definition of a depression. And most people don't have a good definition of depression, and economists don't even use what I call the D word. They don't like it because let's compare it to recession, the R word, okay? So recession is well defined. It's two or more, or at least two consecutive quarters of declining GDP. There are a couple other bells and whistles about employment, and there's a referee, the National Bureau of Economic Research, a private, econ think tank in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They call the balls and strikes. They tell you when a recession begins and when it ends, and when the expansion ends, et cetera. But two or more consecutive quarters of declining GDP, that's the classic definition of a recession. So people go, depression sounds worse than recession. And if recession is 2 quarters of declining GDP, a depression must be 10 quarters of declining GDP. It must be way worse. And that's not the definition of a depression. First of all, 10 quarters of declining GDP has never happened. If it did, we'd all be in trouble. But maybe during the Great Depression to some extent, but not otherwise. But that's not the definition of a depression. Depression means depressed growth, meaning you can have growth in a depression, but the growth is depressed relative to trend, relative to potential. So in other words, if your economy, if the long-term trend of recovery growth in a recovery is 3.5%, which it is, and you're growing at 2%, which we were for 10 years, that's depressed growth. You're creating a wedge. So here's the 3% trend line, and here's the 2% actual growth. Well, in between those two lines, that's depressed growth. That's lost output. You could have been here, but you're actually here. And because it's a wedge, guess what? Over time, it gets bigger. I would say we've been in a depression since 2007, that the entire so-called recovery from 2009 to 2019, it was a 10-year recovery, the longest recovery in U.S. history, but it was also the weakest recovery in 10-year history. The average annual growth for that 10-year period was 2.2%. But for all post-1980 recoveries, average growth was 3.2%. And if you go back to post-World War II recoveries, it's closer to 4%. So if you have an economy that can grow 3-4% and you're growing at about 2%, that 1%, 1%, what's the big deal? Sorry, 1% of 20 trillion compounded for 10 years is a big number. You're talking about trillions of dollars of lost wealth, lost output, and from the government's perspective, lost taxes. So that is the definition of a depression. John Maynard Keynes defined it that way. It was good enough for Keynes. It's good enough for me. So I would say we've been in depression in 2007, but the new Great Depression is where we are now. It's by the way, that book has 3 chapters on economics, the new Great Depression, but also has 3 chapters on the pandemic. Disinflation is inflation at a lower rate. So now you still have inflation, but if it goes from 8% to 6% to 4% to 2%, which is what I'm saying, you still have inflation, perhaps inflation of 2%. And that's not trivial. Look at the value of the dollar and a half in 35 years. So it's, by the time you're, most people are young adults at the time the kids are in college. It's about 35 years, so or less. So that's real. But going from 8% to 2% is a big deal for a couple of reasons. Number one, it means that 8% number is not sustained. If it is, if I'm wrong, I don't think I'm wrong. I wouldn't be giving this analysis. But if I'm wrong and inflation goes 8%, then it's probably on its way to 15. So that's a completely different scenario. It's not the scenario I see. But you have to watch.
That what you define as hyper or super inflation then? Well,
you're getting close to hyperinflation at that point. And again, Kim, just to be clear, I do the analysis. I have a view. I look hard at the data. I have models. So I exercise a lot of care on this, but I don't just ignore the alternatives. Sometimes you're wrong and you have to pivot. So we should all be watching for signs of inflation. I don't see them. I see disinflation, which means you still have inflation, but it's at a much lower rate. But there's a world of difference between, let's say, 1.8% inflation and 6.8% inflation. Those are completely different worlds, because one is much more manageable, but it also changes expectations. And expectations are the key. The Fed doesn't control inflation. Everyone's like, oh, they print money, you get inflation. That is not true. It's not true in prices. It might be true in asset prices. It might be true in stocks and bonds and real estate, but that's not the consumer price index. That's not what the Fed looks at. That's not what most economists or many economists mean when they say inflation. They're asset bubbles. Money printing can lead to asset bubbles, but it does not lead to price inflation unless velocity picks up. Velocity is a psychological phenomenon. So if you change the expectations and change the change the psychology and change the velocity, you will get inflation. But I don't see any of those things changing. What I see is this runs out of steam and we get back down to below 2%.
I got one question. I don't know if it's relevant, but
it's a big number. I look at it, but what I look at, and others do also, is you look at the debt to GDP ratio. Right. The number could be, if you have a bigger economy, 30 trillion might be just fine. But you say, well, what's the ratio of the national debt to the size of the economy? Well, when the debt is 30 trillion, which it is, you're right, it just got there, and the economy is about 22, 23 maybe trillion, that's a debt to GDP ratio of 130% or more. So why is that significant? Well, there's a huge body of economic research. We don't have time to go through it all, but Carmen Reinhart and Ken Rogoff have been the leading scholars, but there are many other studies. You don't have to rely on Reinhart and Rogoff, although you can, but there are many other studies that say the same thing. When the debt to GDP ratio goes over 90%, there's no longer any monetary stimulus. It's a headwind to growth. The Keynesian idea, you borrow $1, spend $1, and get $1.20 of growth. Right? Borrow $1, spend $1, and get $1.10 of growth. But the number keeps getting smaller. What happens when you borrow $1, spend $1, and you get 80 cents of growth? You didn't even make your dollar back. And so now the debt to GDP ratio is getting worse. That effect is getting worse. You're off the right hand of the diminishing marginal returns curve. You're actually into negative marginal returns. So not only is it not stimulative, calling the Biden thing stimulus is nonsense. Not only is it not stimulative, it's a headwind to growth, number one. Number two, the people say, well, we'll never be able to pay off the national debt, the $30 trillion. You don't have to pay off the national debt, but you do have to roll it over. That's the key. So as an old, a 10-year note that you issued 10 years ago matures this year, you got to pay off that note. Well, maybe you issue a new 10-year note, or maybe you issue a new 30-day bill or a 5-year note or whatever it is. So Treasury securities are maturing all the time, every day. New securities are being issued, at least weekly, sometimes daily, depending on maturity. And that's the system Alexander Hamilton invented in 1789. And it's been going strong for 230 years. But it's always been based on confidence and good management. In U.S. history, and I cover this in chapter 2 of my book, Aftermath, U.S. history shows that, the debt goes up, but it always goes up. The debt to GDP ratio goes up in times of war. And then in times of peace, we pay it back down again. Then it goes up in a war, and then it comes back down again. So you can think of it as dry power. It's almost like, ammunition and gunpowder and artillery, or, today jets or cruise missiles or whatever. You keep your debt to GDP ratio modest so that you can ramp it up when you have to. That's gone, thanks to Stephanie Kelton and Janet Yellen and modern monetary theory and Bernie Sanders and a lot of other influences. That's gone. Now, the debt to GDP ratio is at a very high, historically high wartime level, even higher, but there's no war. What are you going to do if there is a war? Where's your borrowing power then? Or something like the Great Depression, not the technical definition I gave, but, a collapsing economy, where's your borrowing power then? And that's the problem. It's not that you have to pay off the debt. You do have to roll it over. And when you lose confidence, you can't roll it over. Then you lose confidence in the dollar itself.